Hello, my name is Richard Hale. On Thanksgiving, while I sat at the same table as my family, my son handed his in-laws the keys to a $500,000 car. And me. He gave nothing but an insult that cut deeper than any blade. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just losing respect. I was being erased. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story. That Thanksgiving, I didn't receive a gift. I received a cut straight across my pride. The chandeliers floated above the long white table like captive moons washing the room in an amber that tried too hard to feel warm. I arrived early enough to be polite and late enough to avoid small talk. Charles Montgomery greeted me with the kind of handshake that measured bone more than heart, a host's smile set perfectly for photographs. Evelyn nodded as if she were stamping a document. Victoria let her gaze pass over me and keep going the way someone checks a mirror frame for dust, but never the portrait. Ethan kept his eyes moving. He laughed with the guests, volleyed compliments, and never once allowed his look to rest on mine. The tuxedo fit him, I'll grant him that, and ambition fit him even better. I had hoped this holiday would remind us both of simple arithmetic fathers. Invest sons, remember. But arithmetic bends when you introduce pride as a variable. The room worked its rituals. Wine poured cutlery, chimed a string quartet, carved the air into polite slices. People exchanged gifts like pledges. Crystal boxes, silk scarves, a watch whose face flashed like a secret. I kept my hands folded and my words economical. You can learn more by listening to laughter than to speeches. Laughter doesn't know how to lie. When the attention curved toward Ethan, he rose with theatrical modesty and tapped a spoon against his glass. A valet rolled in a velvet-draped shape, even under cloth excess announces itself. Ethan grinned toward Charles and Evelyn. To the family who welcomed me as their own, he said, "I hope this carries you into a future as bright as you've made mine." The cloth fell. A low breath emptied from the room. Red paint like fresh synchrome, like fresh ice, a machine priced at $500,000, because there is no price for applause. Cameras bloomed. Charles clapped Ethan's shoulder as if he were knighting him. Evelyn dabbed at eyes that were not wet. Someone whispered numbers, engine horsepower, dollars, as if reciting a catechism. I took a sip of wine and let the tannins scratch the back of my throat. I have nothing against cars. I have something against theater masquerading as gratitude. Gifts circled the table again. Smaller satellites around the big new planet now parked at the front steps. When the orbit reached me, Victoria tilted her head and smiled the kind of smile that warns you 1 second too late. For you, she said, a recommendation. Rather than a gift, a recliner would suit you better, so you can sit and wait for old age. Laughter arrived on cue, tidy obedient. A chorus drilled for this line. It slid across the linen and pricked the skin underneath my collar. I set my glass down carefully. In a room of people trained to watch for weakness, stillness is a kind of armor. I counted 3 beats, then 4. I could feel my name moving through the whispers, like a coin being tested for authenticity. Ethan said nothing. He studied his cufflinks as if time itself needed polishing. What you do in the seconds after an insult is an audit of your life. Rage spends recklessly. Restraint accrues interest. I chose the latter. The quartet continued. The car outside idled like a decision not yet made. Charles raised another toast about legacy and vision, words that taste expensive and mean less the more you repeat them. I remembered teaching Ethan to drive in a dented sedan, whose heater coughed every other mile. He had gripped the wheel with both hands and asked me how you know when to brake. before the road tells you I'd said. The servers cleared plates. The chatter rose and fell like a market graph. Noah's laughter bobbed at the edge of it, free of code and currency. Children are the only honest analysts in a room like this. He clambered onto his chair, elbows planted like flags, and looked from his father to me, as if comparing two headlines. His curiosity tugged at the tablecloth of the night. Then Noah's voice rang out over the glass, and silver, small and perfectly clear. "Why didn't you get Grandpa anything, Dad?" Every fork hesitated mid-air. The quartet paused on a note that suddenly had nowhere to go. Cameras lowered, faces turned. Silence at last told the truth no toast could carry. I could have rescued Ethan. I could have rescued the room. But rescue teaches people the wrong math. I let the question breathe. In that breath, I measured the distance between who my son had been and who he was rehearsing to become. Distance can be crossed. Sometimes you mark it first and decide later whether to build a bridge or a border. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. Victoria's fingers tightened on her glass. Charles started a smile and abandoned it halfway. Waiting is not weakness. It is courtesy you extend to truth before it enters the room. Not every gift is innocent. A $500,000 car is nothing more than a dressed-up promise. The days following Thanksgiving carried a chill that lingered far longer than the November winds. For Richard, the sting of public humiliation still pressed against his chest like a bruise that refused to fade. But somewhere else behind walls of glass that reflected the gray city sky, the true weight of that evening was being measured in numbers, contracts, and ambition. Ethan stood in his father-in-law's office, hands shoved deep in his pockets as if anchoring himself. The floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the cityscape, an endless reminder that he was being asked to climb into a world where power was not spoken, but quietly traded. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of air conditioning, sterile and calculated, like everything Charles Montgomery owned. Victoria sat near him, posture rigid, eyes sharp as a blade. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence itself was pressure. "You can't keep living in your father's shadow," she murmured, her tone low but slicing. "Do you want your son to grow up thinking his grandfather is the only man worth admiring?" Ethan flinched at the words. Noah's innocent question from the dinner table echoed faintly in his mind, though he shoved it aside. He wanted to stand tall, to show he was not a dependent son, trailing after Richard Hale's reputation. Yet in this office, between Victoria's precision and Charles's influence, he felt himself shrinking. Charles leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His voice carried the unhurried calm of someone who never needed to rush. "Ethan, opportunities don't wait forever. You have access to something valuable, your father's capital. You know it's sitting there idle, underused. Bring it here and I can make you more than just a son in someone else's story. I can make you a man in your own right." Ethan's pulse quickened. He wanted that affirmation to be more than a man introduced as Richard Hale's boy. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Victoria leaned closer, eyes locking on his hesitation. "This isn't betrayal," she whispered, her voice carrying the sweetness of poison. "It's evolution. Don't you want to provide a future Noah will never doubt?" Her father's wife, Evelyn, entered then, her perfume trailing like silk ribbons. She carried a glass of champagne as if it were a natural extension of her hand. Sitting opposite Ethan, she smiled with an elegance that felt rehearsed. "Darling, this isn't just business, it's legacy. Do you know what it means to be part of this family? It means safety. It means power. Most importantly, It means Noah will inherit more than a name. He will inherit a throne. The words wrapped around him, and the tug of war inside his chest tightened. Richard's calm eyes from the dinner table flashed briefly in his mind, quiet, but unreadable. For a moment, Ethan wondered if those eyes had seen through him, even then. Charles slid a sleek folder across the glass desk. It's not binding. Not yet. A memorandum of understanding. A signal to the world and to me that you're ready to claim your place. His tone was deliberate, each syllable designed to tip the balance. Ethan hesitated, staring at the contract. His reflection stared back from the glossy surface, and for an instant, he wasn't sure if he saw a man rising or a man sinking. He lifted the pen anyway. The ink bled across the paper with the sound of finality far louder than it should have been. When he looked up, Victoria's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Evelyn clapped her hands softly, as if applauding a performance. Charles simply nodded, the gesture of a man who knew the world always bent toward his will. The meeting ended without ceremony. The city night swallowed Ethan as he stepped out of the tower, the cold air biting harder than before. He gripped the steering wheel too tightly as he drove, his breath shallow, his mind rehearsing excuses he would never need to say aloud. On the ride home, he pulled out his phone. The blue glow lit his face, the contract still heavy in his mind. He pressed dial, waited for the familiar voice to answer, and when it did, he exhaled words like a release of pressure. Dad will never know. Silence followed on the line, broken only by the hum of the road beneath the tires. Ethan thought it was done, his secret secure. But from the back seat, a small voice stirred, soft, curious, unaware of the storm it had just walked into. Noah had heard everything. The first week of December arrived with a thin frost and a thicker clarity. I laid the dinner suit across a chair in my study and opened the blinds to a sky the color of unpolished steel. The house was quiet, no quartet, no applause, only the honest sounds of a kettle and the heater. Silence makes a better partner for strategy than noise ever could. I reviewed the folders in the bottom drawer, contracts I had signed, contracts I had refused, ledgers that still smelled of ink. A man who expects storms keeps a barometer. Mine was paper. I copied questions in a notebook, names, dates, flows of money. When I was satisfied, I called Laura Bennett. Laura ran on precision and black coffee. Her office lived in a brick building whose elevators remembered factories. We skipped sympathy. I placed Thanksgiving on the table in spare sentences and waited for her questions. "Show me the paper trail," she said. I told her about Ethan's new circle, the velvet reveal, Victoria's scripted lines. She asked for access trusts, banking letters, any power of attorney language that might have gathered dust. Then she warned me there are ways to force a transfer without a signature, liens calls, clauses that tighten like knots. I left with a list and a timeline. Step 1, audit my defenses. Step 2, find the soft wood in the Montgomery facade. That evening, I met Alan Pierce at a cafe, whose windows steamed in the cold. He shook my hand like a man with nothing left to sell. "They forced a buyout," he said, called it consolidation. Short-term liabilities became timing differences. Debt parked in a subsidiary with a name like a vacation rental. I complained. They filed papers. I bled fees. He leaned in. "You asked for proof. I kept souvenirs." From a scuffed bag, he produced printouts, bound by an elastic band. On top, an email chain, subject lines that grew bolder as dates advanced, approvals that never used the word approval. Below that, 2 versions of the same quarterly report, one to lenders, one internal. The differences were not mistakes. They were decisions. We worked in numbers. Alan walked me through the shell subsidiary, and the ratios. A covenant had been violated and buried. A payment reclassified as deferred consideration to hide the cash bleed. I asked for copies and the question that mattered. What do they need from my side? Liquidity, he said. A respectable face strapped to the front of a train and called a parade. At home, my study turned into a war room. I mapped relationships with pencil and string Ethan to Victoria, to Charles and Evelyn Charles, to a lender whose patience had an expiration date. In one corner, I wrote a single word: consent. The next morning, I returned to Laura with Alan's box. She read like a surgeon reads a scan. "We'll preserve. We'll notify. We'll prepare," she said. She flagged a clause in an old banking letter that, used correctly, would make any attempt to pledge my interests look like a fire in a crowded theater. My phone buzzed at a crosswalk. Noah told me about a school project, and then added, as only children do, "Dad told Mom you'll sign soon anyway." The sentence clicked into place like a lost piece. I told him we'd go to the zoo together soon. I stood there longer than the light allowed. If Ethan believed a signature inevitable, someone had assured him of the mechanism. Either obligations to make refusal look ruinous, or something drafted using my name as lever rather than key. I have seen men do brave things with fear. I have also seen them do stupid things. I called Laura and asked her to search not for the door they wanted me to walk through, but for the trapdoor under the doormat. I messaged Alan for metadata, who edited the reports when and from which machines. Facts travel in packs. By evening, the outlines were ugly, but clear, a memorandum designed to let my silence look like assent. A whisper campaign to lenders, suggesting I had given a private nod, and a calendar circling a date 2 weeks out. The rope was not around my neck yet, but it had been measured. I spread everything across the dining table and left a single lamp burning. In that circle of light, the Montgomery evening looked less like humiliation and more like opening night. They had written the first act. I would write the last. Before sleep, I drafted a checklist on a yellow pad: inventory, authorities granted and revoked, freeze discretionary transfers, alert counterparties that any representation of my consent required written confirmation from me personally. I added a line I rarely use: instruct counsel, to prepare for injunction if needed. Preparation is not aggression. It is the refusal to donate surprise to your opponent. In the morning light, the house resumed its honest sounds: the kettle, the heater, the pencil scoring another line across the page. I felt no anger, only velocity. People mistake calm for softness. In business, calm is simply the absence of wasted motion. On my desk, I placed a single object beside the files: an old dented key from the sedan, where Ethan learned to drive. Metal holds memory better than people do. I turned it once in my palm, then set it down as a reminder. Control begins at the ignition. They handed me a pen, but in truth, it was a silken rope. The meeting was staged as though it were diplomacy, not business. A suite at the Langston Hotel, 12th floor, curtains, drawn to keep out the winter dusk. The lamps were too low, the table too long, the air too still. No champagne this time. Only folders, water glasses, and the quiet throb of central heating. Richard sat at one end, back straight, expression unreadable. He wore the same charcoal suit he had used for negotiations a decade earlier, the kind that never betrayed the man inside. Across from him sat Ethan, shoulders squared, chest rising like a man rehearsing his victory. Beside Ethan, Victoria, in flawless silk posture honed for courtrooms she never had to attend. And at the head, Charles and Evelyn Montgomery, hosts without warmth, arbiters without law. Laura Bennett was at Richard's side. She had not spoken since entering, but the fountain pen clipped to her folder seemed sharper than any blade. Ethan began, voice firm but eager. "Father, this is a simple transfer. It's clean. It secures your stake while positioning me to grow it. Montgomery Consolidated will absorb the liability, and you'll retain an honorary position. No risk, all reward." He slid a document across the table. A summary page faced Richard consent to capital realignment. Charles interjected smoothly. "Richard, litigation is a costly sport. Refusal will force our hand. Courts don't take kindly to obstruction. Better to resolve as family." Victoria's smile was razor thin. "You've carried weight long enough. Time to rest. Let Ethan shoulder the future. You can go home, pour your whiskey, and let us handle what comes next." Richard rested his hand on the pen before him. He rolled it once between his fingers, as though testing its weight. His gaze drifted across each face, his son's anticipation, his daughter-in-law's disdain, the Montgomerys' assured arrogance. He lowered the pen to the page. The nib hovered a fraction from touching, as though surrender were only a breath away. The room leaned forward. Ethan's lips parted. Charles's cufflink glinted. Evelyn's eyes narrowed in triumph. The silence hummed like a violin string stretched to breaking. Richard's hand stilled. Then, with perfect calm, he lifted his eyes. "Before I sign," he said softly, "I'd like to see Montgomery Consolidated's full financial statements. After all, those with nothing to hide nothing. Isn't that right?" The words landed like a dropped glass. Ethan blinked, uncertain. Charles's jaw twitched. Evelyn covered it with a cough, but her knuckles whitened around the folder she held. Victoria tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Father, this isn't necessary," Ethan began. Richard interrupted with a faint smile. "Then producing them should be no trouble." The silence grew heavy, brittle. Seconds stretched. Charles finally cleared his throat. "That level of disclosure isn't standard in a consent transfer. You know that." Laura's chair shifted slightly. For the first time, she spoke, her voice precise, clinical. "Fortunately, we anticipated this." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope. With deliberate care, she laid it flat on the center of the table. Her hand lingered, pressing it down, as though planting a flag. "If Montgomery Consolidated cannot produce its reports," she said evenly, "we can." The words cracked through the air like a pistol shot. Ethan's eyes darted to his father, then to the envelope. His throat worked, as if swallowing sand. Victoria leaned back, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of unease. Charles's face darkened, veins visible at the temples. Evelyn's fingers tapped a furious rhythm on the wood. Richard reclined slightly, pen still, in hand, untouched paper, before him. He had not signed. He had not yielded. And though he looked every bit the calm elder, something colder glimmered beneath the knowledge that they had overreached and that he was no longer playing defense. The lamps hummed. The envelope sat between them all like a live fuse. The silken rope had been offered, but whether it slipped around Richard's neck or theirs would depend on the next move. And Richard Hale had waited his entire life for nights like this. There are walls that collapse in silence, and there are walls that collapse in front of everyone. Christmas Eve at the Montgomery estate glittered, as though scandal could be warded off with lights. The chandeliers blazed, the garlands shimmered, and the great banquet table overflowed with roasts and wine. Guests mingled in tailored suits and sequined gowns, voices pitched in cheer. But beneath the surface, tension seeped like cold air through a cracked window. Richard had been quiet all evening. He greeted those who offered hollow pleasantries, sipped sparingly from his glass, and allowed himself to fade into the corner shadows. Yet his eyes missed nothing. Ethan laughing too loudly, Victoria orchestrating every introduction, Charles and Evelyn hosting with the brittle charm of people terrified their empire might show its fractures. When the evening reached its ceremonial pause, Charles tapped a spoon against his glass. Family friends, thank you for joining us in celebration. On behalf of the Montgomerys, we wish you joy, prosperity, and unity. The room applauded. Richard set his glass down, pushed his chair back, and stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. The applause dwindled into a hush. I, too, Richard said, voice carrying without strain, have a small gift for this family. Laura rose beside him. In her hand was the envelope, the same one she had placed on the hotel table weeks earlier. She walked to the center of the room, heels striking marble with metronomic certainty. The music faded. The chatter died. When she unfolded the first page, the silence deepened further. These, she announced, are internal financial records from Montgomery Consolidated. Records that reveal concealed debt obligations, falsified balance sheets, and fraudulent valuations submitted to both investors and the state. Gasps rippled. A guest's wineglass slipped and shattered. Evelyn stiffened. Charles tried to step forward, but Richard raised a hand. Not yet, Charles. We're not finished. The doors opened. Alan Pierce entered, weathered but unbowed, his presence slicing the air. He held a folder thicker than Laura's. I was pushed out by Montgomery fraud. I was promised equity, then left bankrupt. These are the contracts, the emails, the signatures. Your empire is built on sand. Voices rose in shock whispers, threading like wildfire. Ethan paled. This isn't true. They're lying. Alan's glare burned. Your father signed these. Your mother co-signed. And you, Ethan, you knew. Ethan stumbled over his denial. Victoria placed a hand on his arm, but the gesture was thin, mechanical. Then came the final unplanned blow. Noah's small voice piped up from across the table, cutting through the chaos. But Dad, you told Mom Grandpa was broke. How could he buy me that train set last week if he's poor? The room froze. Every head turned. The boy's innocence sliced sharper than any document. Ethan's face collapsed, exposed and naked. Richard stepped forward, voice level iron beneath velvet. This is the truth. And here is my final word. I have amended my will. Betrayal has a price, and that price is everything. Those who betray me will not inherit a single cent. The declaration struck harder than thunder. The Montgomerys recoiled. The guests recoiled. And Ethan, his son, stood hollowed, a man watching his future vanish in real time. Victoria's mask cracked at last. She slipped her hand from Ethan's arm, her eyes like ice. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out. Her heels rang like nails into a coffin. Ethan remained behind, shoulders, sagging, lips trembling. For the first time, he looked not like a victor or a prodigal heir, but like a boy abandoned. Richard looked at him with neither triumph nor mercy, only clarity. The wall had collapsed, and Ethan stood alone in the rubble. They thought Thanksgiving was the day I was humiliated. In truth, it was the day I began rewriting the rules. The new year arrived, not with fireworks, but with silence. Snow pressed against the windows of Laura Bennett's law office, muffling the city outside. Inside, the air was taut. Richard sat at the polished table, shoulders, squared hands, still. Across from him, Ethan's slumped eyes, shadowed by sleepless nights. Charles and Evelyn sat further down. Their confidence fractured, their empire's decline, whispered already in the financial press. Laura unfolded a thick packet of papers. Her voice carried a tone of finality. This is the amended will and trust declaration of Richard Hale. Effective immediately, Ethan Hale is removed as beneficiary. All prior provisions granting him inheritance are nullified. The words landed like hammer blows. Ethan flinched as though struck. Evelyn gasped softly. Charles leaned back, eyes narrowed, no longer the architect of the room. Richard spoke evenly. Betrayal has consequences. I will not reward disloyalty, not from blood, not from anyone. Laura continued. The assets remain under Richard's full control. Distribution clauses now ensure oversight beyond contestation. Montgomery Consolidated holds no leverage. The silence that followed was colder than the snow outside. Ethan broke it, his voice cracking. Dad, please, I was wrong. Victoria's gone. The Montgomerys are ruined. I only have you. Give me another chance. Richard turned his gaze on his son. No fury, no heat, only granite. A chance is not something you beg for. It's something you protect when it's given. You threw yours away. Ethan's shoulders collapsed. He looked smaller than Noah had days before. Alone, desperate, stripped of every illusion. Charles cleared his throat, but the sound was brittle. Richard, perhaps there's a way forward. Richard's stare cut him short. Your way forward is answering to the regulators and the creditors. I will not carry your ruin on my back. Laura closed the folder, her movements decisive. This concludes the reading. Copies will be filed with the court tomorrow. She glanced at Richard, her expression firm, but almost reverent. She had seen men break under lesser strain. Richard had chosen to sharpen instead. That evening, Richard returned to his house. The rooms were quiet, holding the weight of survival and something more, victory, without celebration. He poured a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching winter light, and sat by the wide window. Snow fell steady, covering the scars of the world in white. For a moment he allowed memory to drift back to the Thanksgiving table, to the laughter turned against him, to the sting of Ethan's betrayal. The cut had been deep, but it had also been a beginning. Now, the wound was cauterized. Ethan had lost Victoria, lost his future, and been left with only the echo of his choices. The Montgomerys faced financial collapse, their name tarnished in every paper. And Richard? He had kept what mattered most, his autonomy, his dignity, and the hard truth that justice is not inherited, it is claimed. He raised the glass slightly, not as a toast, but as a statement. I'd rather have fewer people at my side than be surrounded by traitors. The words hung in the quiet, a seal on the chapter. Outside, the snow thickened. Richard exhaled, calm and unshaken. He thought of next year, of the table that would be smaller, but stronger, filled only with those who understood loyalty's weight. Next Thanksgiving, he said softly to the empty room, I'll invite only those who know how to value what's real. And with that, he drank, watching winter's silence guard his home. Snow still falls outside my window, but inside I finally feel the warmth of peace. Betrayal cut deep, yet it forged a sharper edge in me than I ever thought possible. Justice isn't something handed down. It's something you seize and protect with both hands. And as I raise my glass, I know this much. I'd rather stand alone in truth than be surrounded by liars in comfort.